Sir, I'm afraid there's been a mistake. We need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger. The voice was calm, polite even, but laced with that unmistakable tone of condescension. Flight attendant Jessica Miller stood over Marcus Richardson's seat, her posture confident, her words sugar-coated with forced courtesy. This seat is reserved for our platinum members only, she continued, lips tight. You don't belong here. Behind her loomed Karen Wickfield, white blonde, polished. Every detail about her screamed privilege, from the expensive designer luggage she dragged to the silver watch she tapped impatiently. She wasn't subtle. Her glare cut through the aisle, straight at Marcus, who was seated in 2A. Her voice followed a moment later, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. I always sit there, she muttered, her expression smug. It's practically my seat. Marcus looked up, puzzled. He had done everything right, booked his ticket weeks in advance, paid in full, checked in early. He was a platinum member, just like the flight attendant claimed the seat required. Yet now he was being told very clearly that something was wrong, that he was the problem. Calmly, Marcus reached for his wallet and pulled out a sleek black card embossed with the airline's Platinum Elite logo. I am a platinum member, he said, holding up the card, and this is my assigned seat. Jessica's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in her eyes. Surprise, then annoyance, then resolve. I understand, she said, her tone still dripping with fake sweetness. But this particular seat is usually reserved for one of our more frequent flyers. She nodded toward Karen, still standing in the aisle with a forced look of irritation. The message couldn't have been clearer. You're not supposed to be here. Marcus blinked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. Instead, he leaned back slightly, placing the card back in his wallet. With the grace of someone who had unfortunately navigated moments like this before. I selected this seat for the legroom, he said evenly. I have work to do during the flight. The cabin was unusually quiet. Whispers had started. A few passengers glanced up from their devices. A phone camera discreetly lifted into view from across the aisle. What Jessica, Karen, and the rest of the crew didn't know was that this wasn't just another passenger occupying a seat they felt he didn't deserve. Marcus Richardson was the founder and CEO of Right Tech Solutions, a $2.8 billion AI company that specialized in customer service systems, specifically systems that detect bias and unfair treatment in customer-facing industries. The irony: he was now living the exact type of scenario his technology had been designed to prevent. But Marcus didn't start at the top. Raised in South Chicago, he'd taught himself to code on a used desktop computer when he was 11. While other kids played games, he reverse engineered them, wrote scripts, built basic programs. By the time he was 16, he was writing algorithms that baffled his teachers. Then, tragedy struck. His father, a quiet, hard-working man, was murdered in a senseless act of violence that shook their neighborhood. At the funeral, standing over his father's casket, Marcus made a vow he would build something better, not just for himself, but for the world. Something that would help people see each other as human first. That promise carried him through college into the world of startups and finally into the penthouse offices of Right Tech, where he now led one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country. But none of that mattered right now, not in the eyes of Jessica or Karen, or the system they represented. What did matter? He was a black man in first class, and that alone was apparently enough to trigger suspicion. Earlier that same day, airport security cameras had caught Marcus helping an elderly woman lift her bag, walking her to her gate when she got confused. He had thanked the TSA agents by name, tipped generously at the cafe, held the door for a family with 3 kids. He didn't do any of it for attention. He didn't know anyone was watching. That was just who he was. But none of those quiet acts of decency mattered now, because a flight attendant wanted him out of a seat he had rightfully purchased, because a wealthy passenger expected him to move, and because apparently the crew believed his presence in 2A was a mistake that needed fixing. Jessica tried one more time. Sir, we have another open seat in first class. You might be more comfortable there. Translation: move quietly, or we'll make this ugly. Marcus kept his gaze steady. I'm comfortable where I am, he replied, polite but firm. Jessica's jaw tightened. She turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. That's when the story stopped being about an awkward misunderstanding and became something far more dangerous. From across the aisle, a passenger recorded what happened next. Karen, still standing with her designer handbag clutched like a trophy, leaned over and slipped a folded bundle of bills into Jessica's apron pocket. Thank you for helping with this, she whispered. Jessica didn't even flinch. In a flash, a simple seating dispute became a full-on bribe. One caught on camera. One that would ignite a firestorm that neither of them could have anticipated. Trevor Simmons, the cabin supervisor, now approached Marcus. Clean-shaven, crisp uniform. His walk was all power, his tone all authority. Sir, we need you to move to accommodate our VIP guest, he said, raising his voice slightly so the other passengers could hear. Marcus glanced up again, calm as ever. I've shown my boarding pass and platinum status, he said, holding up the evidence again. This is my assigned seat. Trevor didn't back down. His smile was gone now, replaced with the smug certainty of a man who believed he had the upper hand. Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how things work on this airline, Trevor said slowly, emphasizing every syllable. We prioritize customers who have shown long-term loyalty. Karen rolled her eyes, loudly sighed. I have a meeting right after landing, she announced. I always sit here. This is getting ridiculous. The whispers in the cabin grew louder. Another phone raised. That's when Trevor leaned in close enough for only Marcus and a few nearby passengers to hear. We can do this the easy way, or we can make it difficult. Your call. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly. Then he said 6 words that would change everything. I'm not moving. This is my seat. Trevor stood over Marcus, clearly not expecting resistance. Marcus's refusal didn't come with fire or anger, just calm, controlled defiance. But the tone, the weight behind his words, sent a ripple through the first-class cabin. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Some were openly filming. A few whispered to each other. One woman leaned closer to her window just to get a better view. Trevor, noticing the growing attention, stiffened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. His tone, his posture, his authority, it usually worked. But this guy wasn't folding. He turned on his heel and walked briskly to the front of the plane, gripping the handle of the cabin phone. Passengers watched as he spoke in hushed tones into the receiver. His body language was sharp, agitated, gesturing, pacing, nodding. Something was happening. Something bigger than a seating dispute. 5 minutes passed. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain James Reynolds stepped out, mid-50s, salt and pepper hair, every bit the image of steady leadership. He wore authority like a second skin. His walk down the aisle was slow, deliberate. Trevor and Jessica followed behind him. Jessica's eyes flicked nervously toward the phones, now recording from multiple angles. The mood in the cabin had shifted. This wasn't a service issue. This was now a scene. And the passengers weren't just watching, they were judging. The captain stopped at Marcus's seat, looming over him, like a judge stepping up to the bench. Sir, he began in a firm, steady voice. I understand there's a situation here. Marcus looked up. Yes, Captain. I've been told I need to move from my assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's preference. I've shown my boarding pass and my platinum card. This is the seat I paid for. The captain nodded slowly, clearly aware that every word was being documented. Still, he pressed forward. My crew has the authority to make seating changes as necessary for the comfort of all passengers. Marcus leaned back slightly, still calm. I understand that, but this isn't about comfort. This is about me being asked to leave a seat I purchased because someone else wants it. There's no policy that justifies that. Trevor stepped forward again, cutting in before the captain could respond. If you don't comply, he said, his voice lower now, edged with frustration, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight. Marcus's brow lifted. You're threatening to remove me for refusing to give up the seat I purchased. Passengers shifted in their seats. One of them audibly gasped. Karen, still standing nearby, took the moment to escalate things further. This is outrageous, she shouted, waving her arms for emphasis. I have a connection to make. I can't believe this is still going on. I've never been treated so poorly. Several passengers exchanged glances. Some looked visibly uncomfortable. A man in the second row shook his head in disbelief. The captain hesitated. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. Sir, he said again, firming up his stance. This is your final warning. Move to another seat or we'll involve airport security. And that's when Marcus reached into his jacket, not with a rush or aggression, but with the slow, deliberate calm of someone who'd made a decision. He pulled out his phone, tapped the camera, and began recording. I want to be clear about what's happening, Marcus said aloud, speaking directly into the camera. I'm being threatened with removal from this flight because I won't give up my assigned seat to accommodate another passenger's preference. Jessica's eyes widened. Trevor stiffened. You can't record, Trevor snapped, reaching toward the phone. That's not allowed. Marcus pulled it back. There's no federal law that prohibits passengers from recording unless it interferes with crew duties. I'm documenting this for my protection. The legal correction hit Trevor like a slap. He backed off slightly, but his expression twisted with frustration. And then, footsteps, heavy, rhythmic. 2 uniformed airport security officers appeared at the front of the cabin, the kind of presence that makes everything else go still. The first officer scanned the aisle, his eyes landing on Marcus. Following Trevor's subtle hand gesture, they walked toward 2A. The cabin went silent. Phones were held higher now. Nobody even pretended to read or scroll. Marcus didn't move. He didn't panic. He just sat there. The first officer cleared his throat. Sir, we've been asked to remove you from the aircraft due to a disturbance. Marcus nodded, acknowledging him. What airline policy have I violated? He asked. Voice steady, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. The officers looked at each other. It was clear they weren't prepared for that question. You're being asked to leave by the captain, one replied, sidestepping the issue. I'd like clarification, Marcus said. I'm in my assigned seat. I have platinum status. I've caused no disturbance. Am I being removed because I wouldn't switch seats with another passenger? The captain, still standing a few feet away, didn't respond. Instead, he looked away. Another passenger spoke up, clearly shaken. This is wrong, she said quietly. He didn't do anything. I've been filming everything, someone else added from the back, since the first time that flight attendant approached him. Marcus exhaled slowly. He picked up his tablet, closed it, placed it carefully in his bag, folded his presentation notes. Then, with the same calm he'd shown all along, he stood up. As he stepped into the aisle, a voice piped up near the front. Serves him right, someone whispered. He clearly doesn't belong in that seat anyway. Another passenger, bold enough now, replied loud and clear. He paid for it. This is ridiculous. Marcus walked with his head high, spine straight, gaze forward. As he passed Trevor, there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Not anger, not fear, but clarity. The kind of clarity that only comes when you've been through this before and know how to turn pain into purpose. As he moved toward the front, something unexpected happened. Karen leaned in toward Trevor, slipped another folded bill into his pocket. Thanks for taking care of that, she said. Several phones caught it. The whisper, the cash, the moment. That moment would later become one of the key pieces of evidence that turned a viral video into a firestorm. As Marcus stepped off the plane, he opened his phone and fired off a quick text. To Elise, his COO, I was just removed from a Skylux flight. They picked the wrong person to humiliate. Marcus stood in the jet bridge, shoulders back, eyes calm, his fingers moving across his phone screen with calculated precision. He wasn't flustered. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Years of facing subtle and not so subtle discrimination had taught him something more powerful than anger strategy. A voice message went out to his COO, Elise Thompson. Elise, get the legal team. We're going to need full documentation of this incident immediately. I was just removed from Skylux Flight 1140. I have video, and now I'm going to make sure this never happens again. The security officers who had escorted him stood awkwardly nearby. They weren't celebrating. They weren't proud. In fact, one of them looked downright uncomfortable. The officer flipped through a tablet reviewing the incident report, his brow furrowed. This says you were removed for being disruptive, the officer muttered almost to himself. Marcus heard him and turned slowly. Is that right? He asked. The officer looked up. His eyes met Marcus's, and something in his expression shifted. Doubt, guilt, maybe both. I'd like to understand what rule I broke, Marcus said, still calm. Because I sat in the seat assigned to me on my boarding pass. The officer exhaled, finally lowering the tablet. Sir, I think there may have been a misunderstanding. Marcus didn't say, I told you so. He didn't have to. Instead, he opened his voice recorder app and began documenting everything he remembered, every word said, every detail. As he spoke, his tone remained measured. This wasn't venting. This was evidence. Then came the soft voice from behind. Excuse me, sir. Marcus turned. It was the woman who had been seated across the aisle in first class. Late 20s, brown hair pulled into a tight bun, glasses still fogged from stress. She clutched her carry-on in one hand and her phone in the other. I followed you off the plane, she said nervously, glancing around. I couldn't sit there and pretend this was okay. She held out her phone, the screen already open to a video. Clear, unshaken. The entire interaction captured from the moment Jessica first approached Marcus to the very second he was led away, and the damning moment where Karen slipped that second bribe into Trevor's pocket. I recorded everything she said. I'll send it to you, and I'll testify if it comes to that. Marcus took a slow breath, his shoulders softening for the first time since the confrontation began. Thank you, he said, his voice full of quiet sincerity. That may help more than you know. They exchanged contact info. Neither of them knew that within the next 12 hours, her footage would go viral, viewed over 5 million times across multiple platforms. Back on the plane, the mood had shifted again, but this time, unease gave way to smugness. Karen Whitfield reclined comfortably in seat 2A, the very seat Marcus had been forced to leave. Jessica hovered beside her, offering a flute of champagne with a forced smile. We're so sorry for the disruption, Miss Whitfield, she said, her voice a mix of submission and nerves. We'll make sure the rest of your flight is perfect. Karen nodded with satisfaction. In the galley, Trevor and Jessica exchanged glances. Trevor casually pulled the folded bills from his pocket, 2 crisp hundreds, and smirked. Nice bonus today, he muttered. Jessica said nothing, but her eyes lingered on the aisle behind them, where cameras had once again started to rise. The tension she'd felt before hadn't gone away. If anything, it had grown heavier. And then her radio buzzed. Trevor, Jessica, report to the crew comms channel immediately, came the voice of a senior administrator. They looked at each other confused. Trevor pressed the intercom button and leaned in. A moment later, the color drained from his face. Thousands of feet below, inside the shimmering glass tower that housed Skylux Airlines headquarters, CEO Richard Williams sat behind a mahogany desk, flipping through quarterly reports. He sipped his espresso with mild boredom. It was a typical morning until his assistant burst in without knocking. Sir, she said, holding out a phone, you need to take this. Now. Williams raised an eyebrow, annoyed. Can't Janet and PR handle it? It's not Janet. It's the crisis line. It's bad. The phone call lasted all of 2 minutes. Then Williams stood up. Send me the video. Within moments, the footage appeared on his monitor. He watched the entire thing. No interruptions. From Jessica's initial approach to Marcus being escorted off. The camera caught every expression, every slur, every silent complicity. But it wasn't just the discrimination that made his stomach drop. It was the name on the boarding manifest. Who is the passenger? He asked, voice hoarse. The PR director answered without hesitation. Marcus Richardson. Silence. Williams stared ahead, like someone had just told him the plane had crashed. Marcus Richardson, as in the CEO of Right Tech, she confirmed. The same Marcus Richardson we're currently in talks with for the $50 million AI partnership. The same Marcus Richardson, whose company has been quietly buying up our stock for 2 years. Williams sat down hard. Jesus, he whispered. He rubbed his temples, then grabbed his phone. Get me his office, right now. Meanwhile, across town, in a private airport lounge, Marcus had already assembled his team. Elise, his COO, arrived within 20 minutes, flanked by the head of legal PR and a digital strategist. Laptops were open, screens glowed, phones buzzed. The video is already past 2 million views, said the comms director, holding up a screen. It's spreading like wildfire. Celebrities are reposting. Hashtag Sky Scandal is trending. Elise leaned in, scrolling through the footage. Her eyes narrowed. They don't even know yet, she said, her voice cool. They thought you were just some guy. They had no idea who they put their hands on. Marcus nodded. They were being evaluated for that partnership. We were already analyzing their systems, their culture, their treatment of customers. Well, Elise said, sitting back. They just showed us exactly who they are. Inside Skylux HQ, chaos had broken out. Screens displayed real-time analytics, view counts, rising by the minute, hashtags trending, shareholder chat rooms lighting up in alarm. Williams stood in the center of the room, surrounded by grim-faced executives. We need a statement now, the CFO barked. Damage control, someone else muttered. But then another blow landed. The assistant walked in, phone trembling in her hand. Sir, she said, her voice barely audible. Mr. Richardson is on the line. The room went dead quiet. Williams took a deep breath and answered the call on speaker. Mr. Richardson, he began, forcing civility into his tone. I want to personally extend my deepest apologies for what occurred. Save it. Marcus's voice cut through, crisp and steady. I'm not looking for apologies. I'm looking for accountability. The boardroom froze. I own 25% of Skylux through a mix of holdings and strategic partners. Marcus continued. Effective immediately. I'm calling for an emergency shareholder meeting today. Sir, the PR director whispered. If he pulls out, he's not just a partner, the CFO said. He's our future. Marcus's voice echoed again. Your company just made a $50 million mistake, and I'm not interested in a press release. At Skylux Airlines, HQ panic had replaced protocol. What was once a routine day had erupted into a full-blown corporate crisis, and the room was spinning. Richard Williams, the CEO, looked like the air had been sucked from his lungs. Every executive in the boardroom stared at the speakerphone as if it were a live grenade. On the other end of the line, Marcus Richardson's voice was composed, but with an edge that made it clear this wasn't just a bad look. This was war. As your largest individual shareholder, Marcus continued, I'm requesting an immediate emergency meeting. Your staff has displayed behavior that's discriminatory, unethical, and now very public. I will not stand by while my investment, my name, and my company's integrity are tied to yours. Mr. Richardson Williams said cautiously, "Surely we can find a way to de-escalate this." "De-escalate," Marcus replied. "You've already escalated it." I was physically removed from my seat, not for breaking a rule, not for being unruly, but because your staff didn't like the way I looked, sitting in first class. You want de-escalation? Then start by cleaning house. Williams gulped. He knew there was no talking Marcus down. By now, the Skylux social media team was in full-blown disaster mode. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and Skylux discrimination trended across platforms. The original video had crossed 5 million views. Celebrities, politicians, and public figures were weighing in. Even competing airlines had started throwing shade, offering free upgrades to everyday travelers who just want to sit in peace. The clock was ticking. "We'll gather the board," Williams said, standing from his chair. "We'll begin within the hour." But it was already too late. Marcus and his team were 2 steps ahead. Downstairs, in a sterile white conference room, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds were still in uniform, seated in silence. None of them had been given any information about why they were summoned. But they weren't stupid. They knew. The door opened. The HR director walked in, flanked by 2 company lawyers and, most damningly, 2 security officers. Not standard protocol. Jessica swallowed hard. Her hands clenched together in her lap. Trevor's cocky facade was already beginning to crack. The HR director didn't bother with pleasantries. "I'll be direct. Your employment with Skylux Airlines is terminated, effective immediately." Jessica gasped, a tiny sob escaping her lips. Trevor sat bolt upright, his face flushed. "What, you're firing all of us over a seating issue?" Captain Reynolds just closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But his silence said everything. He'd flown commercial jets for 30 years, but he wouldn't survive this. "You weren't fired over a seating issue," the HR director replied, her voice clipped and cold. "You were fired because your actions reflect a failure of judgment, ethics, and responsibility. And because the entire world saw it." She turned the laptop on the table toward them. The viral video played. Jessica's awkward smile. Trevor's smug grin. The exact moment Karen Whitfield slipped money into Jessica's pocket. The exact words she whispered to Trevor. The exact moment Marcus was removed not for breaking any rule, but simply for not surrendering to prejudice. Accepting cash from a passenger to humiliate another guest based on race is not following protocol, the HR director continued. It's a violation of company policy, of FAA conduct standards, and of basic human decency. Trevor opened his mouth to argue. Nothing came out. Jessica began to cry, silently. Captain Reynolds didn't look up. "You'll be escorted to collect your belongings," the HR director said. "Your final pay will include 2 weeks of virulence. That's more than generous." 2 security officers stepped forward. No cuffs, no yelling, just silent shame as the 3 of them were walked down the hallway past coworkers who couldn't even look them in the eye. The same humiliation they had inflicted, now mirrored back. Upstairs, the emergency board meeting had begun. Board members arrived in a rush, some still in golf clothes, others visibly panicked. Within 40 minutes, the entire executive team was seated in a sleek glass conference room with a giant screen at the front. The room darkened as Williams picked up the remote. On the screen, the now infamous video. Silence filled the space as the footage played. Marcus calm and poised. The crew insistent and inflexible. Karen's smug smile. The bribe, the removal, the flight crew's failure to intervene. Every moment captured. When it ended, not a single person spoke for a full 30 seconds. Finally, Williams cleared his throat. "Mr. Richardson, we offer our sincerest apologies." "I'm not here for apologies," Marcus said from the opposite end of the long table. He sat with Elise at his side along with his legal and comms team. I'm here to make two things very clear. He slid a folder across the table. 1. Everyone involved in this incident must be terminated immediately, not suspended. Terminated. He slid another folder across. 2. The proposed partnership between RightTech and Skylux is canceled. Indefinitely. Board members murmured. A few shifted in their seats. Some were already calculating the losses. Mr. Richardson, please, one board member said. These are long-tenured employees. Surely. This isn't negotiable, Marcus cut in. You don't get to make excuses after humiliating your own shareholder in public. If we lose that contract, the CFO said under his breath, we're done. The comms director's phone buzzed. She glanced down and blanched. Our stock's down 12%, she said aloud. Analysts are predicting up to 30% before closing. It wasn't just a PR crisis now. It was a financial collapse in real time. And then, as if on cue, the boardroom doors burst open. A young analyst rushed in sweating, holding a tablet. Sir, he said to Williams, breaking alert. Institutional investors are dumping Skylux stock. They're citing ethics concerns. If we don't act within the hour, Williams stood and looked directly at Marcus. All right, he said, defeated. You'll have your terminations. And what about the cultural rot that let this happen in the first place? Marcus asked. Are you going to fix that? Another silence. And then, surprisingly, Williams nodded. Yes, he said, his voice softer now. It's time we rebuild from the inside. Back in the Skylux employee auditorium, a company-wide announcement was underway. Hundreds of employees gathered whispering to each other, unsure why the CEO himself was addressing them with such urgency. Williams stood on stage beside Marcus and Elise. Today, Skylux Airlines failed one of our passengers, Williams began. And not just any passenger, but one of our own shareholders. This wasn't a mistake. It was a reflection of deeper issues we must face. He paused, took a breath. As of tomorrow, we are grounding all flights for 48 hours. Gasps rippled through the audience. We will use that time to begin mandatory bias and ethics training. A program developed by Mr. Richardson's team. A program that every single employee, including myself, will complete. Marcus stepped forward. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about transformation. About facing hard truths and becoming better. The room was quiet, but something was changing. For the first time, perhaps in years, there was clarity in the room. Real accountability and a real chance for change. The news of Skylux grounding its entire fleet spread across the aviation industry like wildfire. Airlines don't shut down for anything, not even hurricanes. So when one of the world's top-tier luxury carriers announced a 48-hour global suspension of all operations, it wasn't just a headline. It was a historic move. At airports across the U.S., confused passengers listened to announcements echoing through terminals. Due to internal corporate operations, all Skylux flights are temporarily suspended. Some groaned. Others pulled out their phones and found out why. They saw the video. They read the hashtags. And one name kept surfacing: Marcus Richardson. Meanwhile, inside Skylux's towering glass headquarters, things looked very different. Conference rooms were repurposed into temporary training centers. Projectors were wheeled in. HR departments scrambled to set up stations. And Marcus's team from RightTech moved in with near-military precision. Behavioral psychologists, AI specialists, diversity educators. They weren't there to run a PowerPoint presentation. They were there to change an entire company's DNA. Marcus personally attended several of the initial sessions. He didn't sit in the back. He stood in front of the room, and he started every session the same way. What happened to me happens to people every day. People without my platform, without cameras, without anyone to speak up for them. This training isn't just about me. It's about every passenger who's ever been judged before they spoke a single word. For some employees, his presence alone shattered the wall of corporate detachment. For others particularly, those in higher positions, there was resistance, eye rolls, arms crossed, a few whispered complaints about overcorrection and cancel culture. But Marcus didn't flinch. He called it out. Bias doesn't always wear a hood or carry a sign, he said. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it offers champagne. But it always draws lines between who belongs and who doesn't. Jessica, the flight attendant, sat in one of the early sessions. Not in uniform, not smiling. She wasn't there to teach. She was there to learn. And surprisingly, she stayed after the session ended. Sat alone at a side table, quietly watching Marcus as he spoke with others. After a while, she approached him. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, barely above a whisper. "But I need to say, I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing. I smiled and hoped it would go away. I'm sorry." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Recognizing it is step one. Now, let's see what you do next. Meanwhile, the three former Skylux employees, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds, were all facing the aftershocks of their decisions in the real world. Trevor sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through rejection emails. "Thank you for your application." After careful review, every response was the same. He had become unemployable. His name was now searchable, tied forever to one of the most viral discrimination scandals in airline history. Jessica fared no better. Even her attempts to apply for jobs outside the airline industry failed. During one virtual interview that showed promise, the manager paused mid-conversation and asked, "Wait, you're not the Jessica from the Skylux video, are you?" Interview over. Captain Reynolds, with 30 years of experience, found himself staring at a future he never imagined grounded for good. No major airline would touch his application. Even smaller regional carriers ghosted him after the second interview. Their careers were gone, not because of one bad decision, but because of all the little ones that came before it. Karen Whitfield, the passenger who lit the match, wasn't immune either. She sat in her spacious living room, watching herself on a national news segment. The host dissected every second of the video, zooming in on the moment she slipped the bills into Trevor's pocket. Her company had placed her on administrative leave. Clients had canceled meetings. Invitations to charity events, luncheons, and networking galas disappeared without explanation. Worse still, she was now the face of viral infamy. On TikTok, airline Karen memes trended for days. Her name became shorthand for entitlement. Her image was plastered across think pieces, late-night monologues, and even mock Halloween costumes. She wasn't just banned for life from Skylux, she was radioactive. And for the first time, Karen Whitfield had to confront a world where her money couldn't buy her out of accountability. Back at Skylux, something remarkable was happening. The employees who once operated on silent bias and unspoken rules were now being forced really, to confront it all head-on. The training wasn't some slideshow of outdated HR quotes. It was hard. It used simulation modules. It showed real-world examples. It forced participants to sit through testimonials from passengers who had been profiled, mistreated, ignored. It showed them how just following policy could become a shield for discrimination. And Marcus, despite what had been done to him, showed up every day. Not for retribution, but for change. He stood in front of groups and said, "This isn't about making you feel bad. This is about making you feel aware." For some, it clicked. For others, it was uncomfortable. But that discomfort, that tension, was exactly the point. As one ground staff member said quietly after a session, "I didn't think I had a bias. But I see now. I just didn't see people. Not really." When the 48-hour grounding ended, Skylux didn't immediately go back to business as usual. They resumed flights, but with new policies, new checklists, new procedures. Every seating dispute now required escalation review by 2 leads. Bribes or gifts from passengers were explicitly prohibited. Flight attendants were trained on implicit bias, not just once, but annually. But more than that, passengers noticed something different: a new tone, a new awareness. At terminals across the country, news crews interviewed flyers coming off Skylux flights. They actually called me by name, one black passenger said. Before, I used to feel invisible. Another added, I had a seating issue and braced for the usual awkwardness, but the staff handled it with respect. I didn't feel judged, and the numbers backed it up. Customer satisfaction for Black, Latino, and Middle Eastern passengers jumped 37% in 1 month. Marcus didn't celebrate with fireworks. He didn't give a victory speech. He just sat down in his office with Elise, reviewed the new numbers, and gave a small nod. We're not done, he said, but we're no longer pretending the problem doesn't exist. 6 weeks after the Skylux scandal broke the internet, something incredible began to happen. The story didn't fade away. It grew, not in outrage, but in momentum. Articles no longer focused solely on the video or Karen Whitfield's audacity. Now, journalists were writing about what Skylux was doing next. The 48-hour grounding had become a case study in business schools praised not just for boldness, but for authenticity. Other airlines took notice. One international carrier launched a similar training initiative, citing Skylux in its press release. A smaller budget airline tweeted, "We can't afford champagne seats, but we can treat everyone like they matter." Even competitors, many of whom had quietly benefited from Skylux's embarrassment, now found themselves being asked the same question by their customers. What are you doing to make sure this never happens on your flights? Meanwhile, inside the rebuilt culture of Skylux Airlines, things weren't just improving, they were transforming. The entire employee handbook was rewritten. Language that once vaguely referenced professional conduct now spelled out specific consequences for discriminatory behavior. The policy on accepting passenger gifts gone, replaced with a strict code of ethics and a hotline for anonymous reports. Internal communication channels buzzed with one phrase over and over again. It starts with us. Executives who once spent board meetings discussing fuel costs and catering menus were now hosting roundtable sessions on equity and bias. Cabin crew leads were required to complete quarterly check-ins, sharing examples of inclusive behavior, not just reporting the bad, but highlighting the good. Marcus's company, RightTech, implemented a real-time bias tracking system into Skylux's customer service and incident report software. Any recurring patterns, passengers flagged for seat confusion security calls involving minority passengers, repeat staff complaints were automatically flagged and reviewed by a new internal team called the Integrity Board. It wasn't perfect. There were still hiccups, still misunderstandings. But for the first time in decades, there was progress. Real, uncomfortable, measured progress. As this cultural shift took hold, Marcus remained involved not as an overlord, but as a guide. He continued showing up to sessions, not to monitor, but to participate, to listen, to ask questions. During one training, a young gate agent raised her hand. "I'm afraid I'll say the wrong thing," she admitted, "that I'll mess up and get fired." Marcus smiled gently. "You probably will mess up," he said. "We all do. What matters is whether you shut down or learn." Progress doesn't require perfection, just the guts to get uncomfortable. That quote, "progress doesn't require perfection," was later printed on every Skylux employee badge just beneath their name. Meanwhile, Trevor, Jessica, and Captain Reynolds were beginning very different journeys. They had lost their jobs, their reputations, their identities as airline professionals. But Marcus didn't believe in canceling people permanently. He believed in accountability with a door to redemption. Through the Richardson Foundation, he launched a new initiative, the Second Chance Program. It was designed for professionals who had been fired for bias-related incidents but had demonstrated genuine remorse and a willingness to grow. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a deep, immersive, grueling rehabilitation program that included therapy, public service education, and honest reflection. Trevor was the first to enroll. At first, he resisted, argued that the whole thing had been exaggerated, that he'd just been following protocol. But during his third week in group sessions, something cracked. He shared how his father used to scoff at diversity programs, how he'd grown up hearing that some people just don't belong in first class. I thought I was better than all that, Trevor admitted. I didn't use slurs. I treated everyone the same. But when a black man sat in 2A, my brain didn't see a customer. It saw a disruption. That moment of honesty became a turning point. He didn't just say the words, he meant them. Jessica followed shortly after. Her path was different. Her shame ran deeper. She'd been in the service industry her whole life. She'd worked her way up from economy cabin to first class. And when Marcus boarded her flight that day, she didn't speak up, not because she agreed with Karen, but because she was scared. Scared to upset a regular tipper, scared to lose her job, scared to rock the boat. I betrayed everything I believed about myself, she said through tears during a filmed testimonial for the program. I knew better. I just didn't do better. By the end of the 12-week program, she had completed over 100 hours of training, including volunteering at shelters that provided aid to victims of discrimination. Captain Reynolds' journey was the quietest. The oldest of the three, his pride took the deepest hit. But it was also clear he'd spent decades in an industry that rewarded silence, that trained deference to protocol above all else. I failed my passenger, he said during one session, and I failed myself. He didn't apply for new pilot roles. He knew his flying career was over. But when Marcus offered him a chance to mentor new aviation trainees in the Second Chance program, he accepted. Not to teach flying, to teach conscience. Months later, a reporter interviewed Marcus for a major feature on corporate reform. Do you regret what happened that day? She asked him. Marcus paused. I regret that it had to happen for change to start, he replied. But I don't regret what came after. Sometimes justice shows up loud and messy. Sometimes it shows up with a boarding pass and a camera. The piece was titled The Man in 2A Changed the Skies Forever. And it wasn't an exaggeration. 6 months after the incident, Skylux had regained nearly all of its lost stock value. But more importantly, it had gained something harder to measure trust. Passenger surveys now ranked Skylux #1 in customer fairness, surpassing every other U.S. airline. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't tweet clapbacks or post celebratory selfies. He just kept doing the work. In quiet conference rooms, in long meetings, in short conversations with employees who finally saw the passenger in front of them as more than a ticket number. They saw a person. It was a bright spring morning when Marcus Richardson boarded another Skylux flight, this time quietly without fanfare, without cameras, without controversy. Same airline, same gate, same seat 2A, but everything else had changed. The gate agent who scanned his boarding pass looked him in the eye and said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Richardson. Thank you for flying with us again." There was no hesitation in her tone, no flicker of discomfort, just a genuine smile, a real welcome. He nodded and returned the smile with a quiet thank you. The cabin crew on board, 2 women and a man, all in fresh, modernized Skylux uniforms, greeted him just as professionally. Not over the top, not performative, but respectful, balanced. The same cabin that once buzzed with tension was now calm. There were still first-class passengers dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses, but gone was the unspoken hierarchy of who looked like they belonged. People simply boarded, sat down, and relaxed. As Marcus settled into seat 2A, he pulled out his tablet, opened the same keynote presentation he'd been working on the day he was kicked off the flight months ago. He smiled to himself at the irony, at the growth, at the journey. He never did give that speech at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference. But that was okay, because his actions had become the speech. And the audience, the whole world had watched. In the weeks following the training programs, Skylux released a comprehensive transparency report. It detailed every change the airline had implemented since the incident. No sugarcoating, no PR spin. Over 4,000 employees completed immersive bias training. 28 high-risk policies were rewritten with inclusion-first language. The company created a new department, Passenger Experience Equity (PEE), with direct reporting access to the board. Anonymous internal whistleblower reports rose by 63%, a sign that employees finally felt safe speaking up. Marcus reviewed the report in full before giving his approval to begin reinvesting in Skylux. He did so cautiously, incrementally, not as a silent partner anymore, but as a watchdog with a seat at the table. And Skylux didn't just tolerate it, they welcomed it. Because by now, everyone understood real transformation isn't something you finish. It's something you live. One of the most profound moments came 3 months after the initial grounding, when Skylux announced its new Equal Wings Initiative, a scholarship program for aspiring flight attendants and pilots from marginalized backgrounds. The launch event was held in a hangar converted into a stage with banners reading "Diversity Takes Flight." Dozens of young people stood in rows, some fresh out of high school, others switching careers, all of them beaming with excitement. They wore navy polos embroidered with the Equal Wings crest. And one of their speakers, Jessica, she stood at the podium, nervously adjusting the microphone, and then began. "I made a mistake that hurt someone," she said, her voice strong. "And instead of running from that, I joined a program that helped me face it. I want to use what I've learned to help others get the second chances I was lucky enough to receive." Behind her, Trevor stood quietly, helping set up chairs for the next group. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted the work. Both of them had been offered re-entry jobs through the Richardson Foundation's partner companies. Jessica was accepted into a regional airline's ground crew and later promoted to customer care training. Trevor was hired as a logistics coordinator at a cargo airline, working behind the scenes but making things move. Captain Reynolds, now semi-retired, had become something else entirely, a mentor. Every month, he taught a class within the Equal Wings program titled "The Captain's Responsibility." He didn't use slides. He told stories about choices, about silence, about moments when authority is challenged not by aggression, but by presence, like the kind Marcus had shown. During one session, a trainee raised his hand. "What would you do differently now?" Reynolds paused. "Everything," he said. "But mostly, I would have said something." Because staying quiet is how people get hurt. Karen Whitfield, she was never charged. Her actions didn't rise to the level of a formal crime. But she lost something more valuable than money. She lost her anonymity. She lost her seat on the boards of 2 charities. She lost contracts at her boutique firm. She spent months denying, avoiding, defending, until finally she disappeared from the spotlight. No apology ever came. No interview, just silence. Sometimes, the most painful part of accountability isn't what's taken from you. It's what you have to sit with when everything else is gone. 6 months to the day after Marcus was removed from Seat 2A, Skylux celebrated its most successful quarter in years. Not in profits, but in trust. Their customer satisfaction rating hit a record high across all demographics. Retention was up. Complaints were down. Media coverage had shifted from scandal to praise. Airline industry watchdogs noted that Skylux had become a benchmark for rapid ethical reform. And for the first time ever, an airline issued a public apology that didn't come from legal teams, but from its CEO on camera. Face unblurred, voice unwavering. Williams spoke directly to passengers. "We failed someone who trusted us. We failed many more who've experienced similar treatment in silence. But we heard you, and we're not going back to the way things were." Marcus didn't need recognition, but one day, As he walked through Skylux's main terminal hub, he noticed a new installation near the first-class lounge. A glass plaque, minimalist, elegant. It read, "In honor of every traveler who's ever been told they don't belong, this seat is for you." Beneath it, a mock-up of seat 2A, surrounded by velvet ropes, not to elevate status, but to remind everyone that the value of a seat has nothing to do with who's sitting in it, and everything to do with how they're treated once they do. Marcus stood there for a long moment, not angry, not sad, just grateful, because for the first time in a long time, it felt like something had truly taken off. A few days after seeing the seat 2A installation at Skylux's main terminal, Marcus returned home, slid his briefcase under his desk, and sat in the same worn leather chair he'd used for years, even when he'd become a billionaire. He stared at the wall for a moment, then opened his laptop. In his inbox were messages from around the world. CEOs, airline executives, startup founders, journalists, students, thousands of people who had seen the video and then the transformation that followed. Some were looking to replicate the reforms at their own companies. Others just wanted to say thank you. But one message stood out. Subject, you probably don't remember me. It was from a man named Eric D., a former TSA agent who worked at O'Hare when Marcus was still a kid, flying to college interviews. You probably don't remember me, the message read. But years ago, you used to come through my checkpoint carrying that old laptop and a plastic bag of clothes. You always smiled, always respectful. I remember thinking, this kid's gonna go places. I watched the video. I saw what happened on that flight. And I just want you to know you've been showing people how to treat others for a long time. We just finally started listening. Marcus read it twice. Then he hit reply. Thank you, Eric. I remember. At Skylux, the Equal Wings program had expanded so quickly that they had to lease extra office space to house the next training cohort. Elise Marcus's COO sat across from a new batch of applicants in a wide conference room, full of light and possibility. These weren't just future flight attendants or pilots. They were single parents, immigrants, veterans, former inmates, people who had been told no 100 times now, being given one life-changing yes. One applicant, a young woman named Darlene, had been homeless the year before. Now, she stood proudly in a Skylux training uniform, rehearsing her welcome greeting in front of an instructor. Good morning, and welcome aboard Skylux, she said, beaming. We're honored to have you flying with us today. It wasn't just a line, it was earned. Meanwhile, Marcus continued quietly investing in other industries, education, healthcare, hospitality. But he had a new rule for every company his firm touched: bias audits. If his money was going into a business, it had to undergo a full assessment of its treatment of employees, customers, and internal policies. It had to provide data on diversity inclusion, leadership representation, and complaint response times. And if that business failed, no check, no pitch, no second meeting. Money doesn't just build things, Marcus told a group of young Black entrepreneurs during a fireside chat. It also sets the terms. So, I set mine. One attendee raised his hand. What's the most important thing you've learned from all of this? Marcus didn't even hesitate. That leadership, he said, isn't about how loudly you talk. It's about who you listen to when everyone else stays quiet. Karen Whitfield had all but vanished from the public eye. Once a familiar face in glossy publications and country club rosters, she now spent most of her time indoors, away from cameras, away from the community she once ruled. She'd tried issuing a statement months ago. Something cold, written by a lawyer, not a person. It backfired. Now, her phone rarely rang. Her inbox sat empty. The friends who used to invite her everywhere no longer remembered her name. But some nights, she couldn't escape her own thoughts. She would stare at the ceiling and hear Marcus's voice not from a recording, but from memory. Calm, direct, unshakable. There's no policy that requires me to give up my seat to someone else's preference. She had laughed when he said that. Now, it haunted her, because deep down, she finally understood. She hadn't just taken a seat. She had tried to strip a man of his dignity, and she'd lost far more than a first-class view in the process. Trevor and Jessica's lives were slowly rebuilding. They didn't get to go back to their old jobs. They didn't try. But Trevor, now working in logistics, took a bus every Saturday to volunteer at Equal Wing seminars. He never spoke unless asked, but he always helped clean up, restock handouts, and reset the rows of chairs that reminded him every single time of how fast a career could vanish with one unchecked bias. Jessica, now a ground crew leader at a regional airline, had started creating onboarding materials of her own. She included exercises she learned from the Second Chance program, and she always ended the training with the same message. If you think silence will protect you, it won't. It only protects what's wrong. She knew that firsthand. Skylux's new advertising campaign launched quietly on a Monday. No actors, no flashy music, just real passengers, real staff, real moments. One ad showed a gate agent helping a mother with 3 kids board comfortably. Another showed a pilot shaking hands with a janitor, both men smiling like old friends. The final shot? Marcus in seat 2A working quietly on his tablet. The voiceover simply said, "Every seat tells a story. Make yours worth remembering." Viewers didn't cry because the ads were dramatic. They cried because they were real. At a global aviation summit later that year, Skylux CEO Richard Williams took the stage. He didn't brag about earnings. He didn't rattle off flight statistics. He spoke for 5 minutes. 6 months ago, he said we were forced to face who we were. Not by a lawsuit, not by a regulation, but by a man who refused to give up his seat. He looked into the crowd. You can build better planes, or you can build better people. At Skylux, we're finally learning how to do both. He stepped off the stage to a standing ovation. In the front row, Marcus nodded once, just once, and smiled. 6 months became 9, and Skylux's transformation only deepened. What began as a headline scandal had become a full-blown case study taught in MBA programs, featured in ethics conferences, and dissected on leadership podcasts. Industry leaders asked, how did they pivot so fast? But the real answer wasn't in crisis management manuals or PR damage control. It was in one decision, Marcus Richardson's decision to stay involved, because most people, after being humiliated the way he had been, would have walked away, sued, burned it all down. But Marcus didn't need revenge. He needed reform, and reform needs roots. On the anniversary of the incident, Skylux held a private memorial of sorts, though no one used that word. It was an internal event for employees broadcast to every terminal and international office called simply 1 Year Stronger. The company invited Marcus to speak, but he declined the spotlight. Instead, he submitted a recorded message projected on every screen. His face appeared familiar and calm. I was removed from a plane for sitting in a seat I paid for, he began. But the real story isn't about me. It's about what came after. He recounted the structural changes, the training, the leadership shakeup, the hires, the firings, the long nights of reprogramming old system software and human alike. But mostly he continued, this story is about people who chose to face the mirror instead of turning away. He mentioned Jessica by name, Trevor, Captain Reynolds, Elise, even Williams. No one gets it right all the time, he said. But real change? It starts with staying when it's easier to run, owning your wrongs when it's easier to hide, and listening even when it hurts. The final line of his message played over a slow fade out of the company's new logo. Sometimes justice doesn't show up in court. Sometimes it shows up in economy, in row 14, watching how we treat the man in 2A. The employees in the audience didn't cheer. They didn't clap right away. They just sat in silence, letting it sink in, and then slowly they rose to their feet, not for show, but for respect. After that, Marcus began getting more calls, not just from airlines, but from cruise lines, universities, hospitals, even police departments. Can you help us build what you built at Skylux? His company, RightTech, had quietly grown into one of the most trusted, ethical compliance tech firms in the world. Their AI tools weren't just measuring customer satisfaction anymore. They were flagging patterns of discrimination, abuse, unfair practices in everything from hiring to patient care. Marcus didn't advertise. He didn't pitch investors. The world came to him because the work spoke. And what it said was simple. There is a better way. One night, while working late at his office, Elise came in holding a thick envelope. "What's this?" Marcus asked. "Mail from Skylux's Integrity Board," she said with a grin. "Internal letters from employees. They wanted to share them with you." Marcus opened it. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes. Some were short. "I was scared to speak up before. Now I do. Your story saved my job and changed how I treat people. I'm proud of where I work again." Others were longer. One came from a new recruit in Equal Wings. "I got this job because of what you endured. Every time I put on this uniform, I remember that I don't have to shrink myself to fit in. I just have to show up and treat everyone like they belong too." Marcus read them all, every word, then closed the folder and leaned back, letting the quiet fill the room. It wasn't just about seat 2A anymore. It was about every room where someone was told they didn't belong, and every system that let it happen. Now those rooms had witnesses, and those systems had watchdogs. Skylux continued to grow, slowly, intentionally. They launched a new flight route named after civil rights pioneers. A mural was installed at their New York terminal, featuring portraits of unsung heroes in aviation history: Black engineers, female pilots, immigrant stewards, people long left out of the spotlight. Under each face was one phrase: "They flew so we could rise." Richard Williams, who had once been known for his bottom-line obsession, now closed every executive meeting with a simple question: "Are we protecting dignity or protecting tradition?" If the answer wasn't dignity, the decision was revisited. As for Karen Whitfield, her world remained small. The scandal had cost her everything she didn't realize was fragile reputation business influence. She eventually sold her consulting firm. The offers had dried up anyway. She moved to a smaller home outside the city, rarely traveled, shopped in anonymity, lived quietly, and every time she booked a flight on any airline, she hesitated at checkout, not because of guilt, but because she wasn't sure if there would be eyes waiting. Phones raised, questions asked, because the era of silent compliance was over. The world had changed. She hadn't, and she knew it. Near the end of the year, Marcus was invited back to speak at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference, the same one he'd missed after being kicked off the plane. This time, he accepted. As he stepped on stage, the audience stood before he said a single word. When the room quieted, Marcus looked across the sea of faces and said, "I came here a year late, but right on time." Laughter, applause, then silence as he continued, "You already know my story. But here's what I want you to remember. Every system is made of people. And every person has a choice. Do I protect the way things are, or do I make space for the way things could be?" He let the question linger, then added, "Don't wait for a scandal to do the right thing. Be the reason no scandal ever happens." He stepped back from the podium, and for a moment nobody said a word. Then the room erupted not with polite claps, but with something rare: conviction. 1 year after the world saw a man quietly refuse to give up his seat, Skylux Airlines hosted a gathering unlike any in its history. It wasn't a press event. It wasn't a shareholder meeting. It was a celebration, a private, powerful one, held in a renovated hangar near Skylux's main terminal. The space had been transformed into a storytelling museum, walls lined with portraits of employees, passengers, and graduates from the Equal Wings Initiative. There were no gold plaques or velvet ropes, only stories. One wall showed a loop of video testimonials from people across the world. A Brazilian flight attendant who implemented a bias training protocol inspired by Skylux. A school principal in Texas who used Marcus's story to teach middle schoolers about standing up for what's right. A Middle Eastern passenger who finally felt safe traveling with her family after years of being randomly selected. In the center of the space, elevated slightly but not behind glass, was a single airline seat. 2A, worn but polished. The original seat removed from that very aircraft. Next to it was a simple plaque. He didn't just sit here, he stood for something. And then as guests filtered in, Marcus entered quietly as always. He didn't wear a suit, just a white button-down sleeves rolled up the way he always dressed when he meant business. Elise walked beside him, beaming. So did Trevor, now officially employed as an outreach coordinator for Equal Wings. Jessica was across the room sharing coffee with new trainees. Captain Reynolds stood near the mural, talking to a group of young pilots. The CEO of Skylux, Richard Williams, took the stage briefly, not to speak about earnings or metrics, but to express one thing: gratitude. I've led this company through many things, he said, but I've never been prouder than I am today because we didn't run from our worst moment. We let it teach us how to be better. He motioned toward Marcus, and we learned from someone who had every right to walk away, but chose to lead instead. Marcus stepped up not to applause but to silence, the kind of silence that means everyone is listening. I used to think justice was something you chased in courtrooms, he began. But that day, justice came with a seat number. He let that settle. It came when people started filming, when passengers spoke up, when employees admitted they were wrong, and when a company decided that protecting people mattered more than protecting ego. He looked around the room. This isn't my victory, he said. It's yours. Everyone who chose to grow, to speak, to act, this belongs to you. He nodded toward the Equal Wings trainees lined up in the back, all wearing fresh uniforms. But don't get comfortable, he added with a smile. Justice is a round-trip ticket. You've got to keep showing up for the return flight. Laughter echoed lightly through the hangar. But it was the kind that comes from relief, from knowing change is possible, and that they were now part of it. Outside the hangar, a storm rolled in. The sky dimmed, but inside the lights stayed on, strong, warm. One by one, people approached Marcus to shake his hand. Some cried, some simply nodded. Some handed him notes saying, "This story changed me," or "I needed to see this." And as the night wound down, a little girl, no more than 7, approached him, tugging at her dad's sleeve. She looked up at Marcus with wide eyes and asked, "Are you the man from the seat?" He smiled. "I guess I am," he said. The little girl reached into her tiny backpack and handed him something folded, her drawing of a plane flying high above a storm. In the window of the cockpit, she'd drawn a tiny stick figure with glasses. "That's you," she said proudly. "You're flying it now." Marcus blinked slowly, overwhelmed by the simplicity of the moment. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep it with me." And he did. Weeks later, Marcus stood at another airport gate boarding yet another flight. The attendant looked up, smiled genuinely, and said, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Richardson." He nodded, walked down the jet bridge, and took his seat, 2A, not because it was symbolic, but because it was his, because he belonged there, because now everyone did.